So I'm wondering if maybe the things that surprised me were a little different because I'm not from Australia and I'm looking at it from a different place.
Yes.
So I think what actually surprised me most was the fact that so many Australians were under the impression that the Jewish population is much, much larger than it actually is. If I remember correctly, about 80% of the respondents had no idea how tiny the Jewish population of their own country was, and nearly half of them were under the impression that the Jews accounted for more than 5% of the total Australian population. So that to me is an indication of how very visible and influential Jews must be in Australian society. And correct me if I'm wrong. By the way, I'm pretty sure that if you pose the same question to Americans, the responses would probably be similar. In other words, I imagine the average American is convinced that the Jewish population in the country is much higher than 2.5%, which by the way is much larger than the Jewish population of Australia.
Maria, I'd like to just ask you about the alignment of the findings or otherwise with the political parties in terms of sympathies for Israel and Palestinians. Was there anything in that that caught your eye in terms of the Conservative Australian Liberal National Coalition and Labor and Green voters?
This is what I was alluding to earlier, is what I thought was the most interesting part of the survey. Because you've got Labor and Green voters scoring relatively low on anti-Semitism and most likely to support the banning of the Nazi symbol on the one side, but Green and Labor voters being 4 or 5 times more sympathetic to the Palestinians vis-a-vis the Israelis.
Right. So
now this goes to the question, this is interesting, because it goes to the question, which is a very important question, of whether opposition to Israel's policies are really just a cover for anti-Semitism. And on the face of it, the survey suggests they're not. But there is a caveat, and that is the possibility that Green and Labor voters, being better educated, are also cannier about what is the correct response to anti-Semitic items in a survey. And that's an open question, I think, where we need rather more sophisticated research than was possible with this particular survey. But on the face of it, I think it's pretty good news.
We're asking me, how do Israelis feel about this? I don't have any figures to give you from a recent poll, but I think that probably it would be correct to say most Israelis do feel that a certain type of criticism of Israel, there are certain red lines, and beyond these red lines, it's clearly anti-Semitism, and they would probably point to the recent attacks on Jews in the past week or two in New York, Los Angeles, London, and say, what did these Jews do? Why do they deserve to be attacked? Clearly, these people hate Israel and they hate Jews.
Yeah. Do you think Israelis care a lot about how their country is perceived by other countries?
I think they do. Everyone cares about how they're perceived. They might say that they don't, and who cares? We do what needs to be done and we don't care. But of course, everyone cares. And look at all the money that Israel pours into so-called hasbara, which is public diplomacy or propaganda, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, we even have this whole new ministry that was set up a few years ago that's dedicated just to this, to fighting BDS, attempts to delegitimize Israel. And, you know, there's a growing network of shlichim, which are like envoys, young shlichim on college campuses around the world. And that's what they do, is they advocate for Israel. So Israel does care. Israel does care very much. And we're talking about events of last week. I think that was part of the reason we had such a relatively quick ceasefire, because Israel understood that every day that went by was just causing damage to the country and its reputation.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move to that now, because that's in the top of everybody's mind. Mari, do you think that if this survey had been carried out last week in the midst of this conflict, the results that we've got here would have been any different, very different?
There may well have been some difference. We've only got one example to look at historically in Australia that I'm aware of, where you can see short events changing opinion to some extent in the short term. In 2006, when there was a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, we had two Morgan polls, one taken in July and one in August. And you saw a shift between July and August. Proportion siding with Israel slipping by 6 points. Proportion siding with Hezbollah slipping by 3 points. And the proportion saying they sympathize with neither side rising by 9 points. In other words, people shifted from an Israeli position or a pro-Hezbollah position to saying basically a plague on both your houses. They wanted the fighting to stop and probably couldn't see much point to it. So I would expect some changes in the course of a conflict, depending on how it was going and particularly how long it had lasted. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this changes underlying views. And the Lowy Institute has conducted a feeling thermometer, as it's called in the business, asking people how they feel from very warm to very cold about a whole number of countries. And they've run this from 2006, unfortunately not from 2005, from 2006 right through to this year. And what you see in that is very little shift in feelings about Israel. Israel is around 50% on the thermometer, which goes from 0 to 100.